Think the American Revolution was just about taxes and tea parties and representation? Well, think again. The real conflict wasn't about just a few policies. It was about power and a British claim to unlimited centralized power in all cases whatsoever. James Madison later called this the fundamental principle on which independence itself was declared, and he was far from alone. Leading revolutionaries like John Hancock, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, and many others all agreed. So on this episode, you're going to learn about the real root cause of the American Revolution that they just never teach about in government-run schools. That's the Declaratory Act of 1766. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome. And thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, March 12th, 2025. Let's get right to it. In response to what Murray Rothbard called the People's Nullification of the Stamp Act, a great description of what went down, the British Parliament recognized that they were losing, so they decided to repeal the Stamp Act pretty much just to save face. But it was kind of like a backhanded compliment because on the very same day that they repealed the hated Stamp Act, that's March 18th, 1766, they still refused to give up their claim to power, of which they were using as a basis for this. So they wanted to reassert that, and they passed an act called For the Better Securing the Dependency of His Majesty's Dominions in America upon the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain, what most people know as the Declaratory Act of 1766. It claimed total, unlimited, centralized power over the colonies and the people, and Parliament said they had, hath, and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America, subjects of the Crown of Great Britain, in all cases whatsoever. So unlimited power. And if that's not enough, just wait. There's even more. Because it wasn't just a claim of total power in the hands of Parliament, it was also a denial, a rejection of all opposition. They continued pointing out that all resolutions, votes, orders, and proceedings in any of the said colonies or plantations, whereby the power and authority of the Parliament of Great Britain to make laws and statutes, as aforesaid, is denied or drawn into question and are hereby declared to be utterly null and void to all in purposes whatsoever. So in other words, even really just publicly objecting to their absolute power was going to be made null and void and in essence, illegal. Now, at the same time, you got to think about the situation that was going on at the time. And people were pretty desperate for a win, I think. And they got one. That was the repeal of the Stamp Act. And even though that was a good thing, it was still enough for a lot of good people to basically let their guard down. And even Benjamin Franklin fell for this trap because there was a repeal, but then also a passage at the very same time. In front of the House of Commons, and in the lead up to passage of the Declaratory Act, this is in February of 1766, he reassured Parliament, or the House of Commons specifically, that the colonies would not object to this passage of the Declaratory Act as long as Parliament didn't actually use it. So if you want to save face and look good, just pass this thing, everything will be cool. So here, for example, from the notes from that event, they asked him, considering the resolutions of Parliament as to the right, and that's the Declaratory Act, the power to make whatever laws they want in all cases whatsoever, that's known as the right. Do you think if the Stamp Act is repealed, that the North Americans will be satisfied? He said, I believe they will. So they asked him why. He said, I think the resolutions of right will give them very little concern if they are never attempted to be carried into practice. And I think that's the trap that, at least early on, Franklin and many others, he's far from alone. This is just an example of how I think people fell for this. The colonies, he said, will probably consider themselves in the same situation in that respect with Ireland, because there was also a Declaratory Act in the early 18th century in response to Ireland, and it was pretty much almost never used. So he's suggesting that, well, if you just want to assert your authority, but not really do stuff, that's going to be fine. He said, they know you claim the same right with regard to Ireland, but you never exercise it, well, at least for a while. And then they may believe you never will exercise it in the colonies any more than in Ireland, unless on some very extraordinary occasion. But not everyone was kind of going along with it. Some people, like John Adams, back when he was one of the good guys, the Atlas of Independence, he immediately was kind of recognizing the potential danger. He was recognizing that this wasn't just a statement. It was a warning of what kind of power might be coming next. And this is how he put it in his diary, April 26th, 1766, the king, lords, and commons now have an undoubted right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatever. I am solicitous to know whether they will lay a tax in consequence of that resolution or what kind of a law they will make. So Adams, right off the bat, just weeks after passage, he's recognizing, well, they're gonna probably use this. Even though other people like Franklin were thinking, well, they've done this before and they haven't used it. So he's wondering. And less than 15 months later, Parliament did indeed put it into practice with something known as the Townshend Acts, or the Townshend Duties. And John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, in his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania in late 1767, was really one of the first and most prominent people to point out the big issue, because it's really all about creating a precedent. He said, the chief object of attention there is, to use Mr. Greenville's expression, providing that the dependence and obedience of the colonies be asserted and maintained. So that's what it was really all about. It was about establishing dependence and obedience, however they were going to do it. And he certainly saw the Townshend Duties as part of that, because he also pointed out in these letters that, well, it's such a trifling sum. The only reason they could be passing this is to establish a precedent to do more and more of the same. He said, under the influence of this notion, instantly on repealing the Stamp Act, an act passed declaring the power of Parliament to bind these colonies in all cases whatever. This, however, was only planting a barren tree that cast a shade indeed over the colonies, but yielded no fruit. Now, fast forward just a few years to early 1772. John Adams was also recognizing this in a speech I think it was at Braintree. He said, if king, lords, and commons can make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever, the people here will have no influence, no check, no power, no control, no negative. In other words, they were just totally in a state of vassalage, literally nothing more. Total power. Now we can jump forward also to November in 1772, when the great patriot Dr. Joseph Warren named the Declaratory Act as the true source of British oppression. We often think of the Declaration of Independence as the only thing that listed some grievances or injuries and usurpations done by the Parliament. But Warren also put together a list of infringements and violations of rights. This is again November 20th, 1772. And he said, the British Parliament have assumed the powers of legislation for the colonists in all cases whatsoever, without obtaining the consent of the inhabitants, which is ever essentially necessary to the rightful establishment of such a legislative. But Warren did not stop there. He also made a pretty brutal comparison, arguing that in some situations under this act, even the Roman Empire treated its subjects better than the British were treating the American colonies. He said, in this respect, we are treated with less decency and regard than the Romans showed even to the provinces which they had conquered. Man, if that does not say a lot, I don't know. But by that point, Benjamin Franklin also came around on this. It did not take him long, because I think he understood this situation pretty well by that point. And on September 11th, 1773, he anonymously published one of my favorite things he's ever written, or he ever wrote, rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one. He used really biting satire and wit as kind of an instruction manual of sorts on how empires come crashing down through hubris, for example. And then after going through all kinds of various grievances with British power, of course, pointing out that this is kind of the path to make this large empire a small one, he hammered on this same message about the Declaratory Act. He said, unless the people should think you cannot possibly go any farther, pass another solemn Declaratory Act, that king, lords, and commons hath, and of right ought to have, full power and authority to make statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the unrepresented provinces in all cases whatsoever. So he's tying in a number of ideas there as well. He said this will include, because if you think unlimited power in all cases whatsoever, that's unlimited. And we'll get to Thomas Paine on that in a little bit as well. He said this will include spiritual with temporal, and taken together must operate wonderfully to your purpose by convincing them that they are at present under a power something like that spoken of in the scriptures, which can not only kill their bodies, but damn their souls to all eternity by compelling them, if it pleases, to worship the devil. And that sarcasm, that wit from Benjamin Franklin is pretty amazing. I actually did a full episode on this. Benjamin Franklin's rules for bringing down empires. I did that about a year ago. I hope you'll check it out if you haven't yet. That will, of course, be linked to in the show notes. And I should mention, as we do for every single episode, we publish a blog post, and we'll get that published a couple of hours after this live stream is done. Alan Mosley does an awesome job getting that organized very promptly after I'm done with it. Well, after I get him files and documents after the show. And he'll get that organized, and I'll get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. The point that I'm trying to make here is really what you're going to look for in that blog post is a show links section, because all the stuff that I'm mentioning, the source documents, that other episode on Benjamin Franklin and the like, they'll all be linked there, generally in the order that I go through them in the episode, so you can read and learn more in context on your own time, because I'm really just scratching the surface here. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Now let's move forward to Samuel Adams. In a letter that he wrote to Joseph Hawley, October of 1773, he also pointed out that Parliament's, basically their strategy was far more dangerous than just taxation. They were really all about establishing a precedent. He said, by assuming the power of making laws for America in all cases, at the time when the Stamp Act was repealed, it was probably their design to secure, as far as they could do it by an act of their own, this particular right of taxation, thinking at the same time that if they could once establish the precedent in an instance of so much importance to us as that of taking our money from us, they should thenceforward find it very easy to exercise their pretended right in every other case. So again, Samuel Adams, father of the American Revolution, here he is in 1773, recognizing that this was really about establishing a precedent, and not just a precedent to do more taxes, but a precedent to exercise this power in every other case. Now, as Richard Henry Lee put it in a letter back to Samuel Adams, just almost a week and a half later, this is October of 1773. At first, even questioning this unlimited power seemed pretty extreme. Mind you, they basically said so in the act itself. It would be null and void to even question it. But by 1773, despite that being in the Declaratory Act, that was not happening anymore. Here's how Richard Henry Lee put it. He said, at first, it was a tender point to question the authority of Parliament over us in any case whatsoever. Time and you have proved that their right is equally questionable in all cases whatsoever. And in John Hancock's amazing 1774 Boston Massacre Day oration, he made it clear that everything that they were facing, of course, being in Boston a few years after the massacre, you also have to think about, closing up the ports, the military being there, the standing armies and the like. And it wasn't just taxation without representation. These are just kind of outgrowths of the root cause. He knew that everything else was an outgrowth of the Declaratory Act. He said they have declared that they have ever had and of right ought ever to have full power to make laws of sufficient validity to bind the colonies in all cases whatever. And he continued to show that they have exercised this pretended right by imposing a tax upon us without our consent. And lest we should show some reluctance at parting with our property, her fleets and armies are sent to enforce their mad pretensions. That's John Hancock in his great Massacre Day oration of 1774. And later that year, in response to the coercive acts, what most people today incorrectly call the intolerable acts, the First Continental Congress passed the Declaration and Resolves October 14, 1774, unanimously, and they made it clear also that the Declaratory Act was the root of everything else. This is literally the first paragraph of that Declaration and Resolves. Whereas, since the close of the last war, that's 1763, we should cover that on this show as well at some point. Whereas, since the close of the last war, the British Parliament, claiming a power of right to bind the people of America by statutes in all cases whatsoever, hath in some acts expressly imposed taxes on them. So they were also recognizing, this is unanimous vote of the First Continental Congress is recognizing that the taxes were just an outgrowth of the Declaratory Act. And then they said, and in others, under various presences, but in fact for the purpose of raising a revenue, hath imposed rates and duties payable in these colonies, established a board of commissioners with unconstitutional powers, and extended the jurisdiction of courts of admiralty, not only for collecting the said duties, but for the trial of causes merely arising within the body of a county. And they went further to explain all kinds of other things that were outgrowths of the Declaratory Act. Of course, they famously, it should be famously said, to these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. That's the kind of backbone that Americans really need to reclaim today. And defending these declaration and resolves and the Continental Association, the plan for a boycott from that First Continental Congress, a young revolutionary Alexander Hamilton, man, he was really good back in the day. He did not hold back. This was not just about a small tax on the people. He said, what then is the subject of our controversy with the mother country? He said, what can actuate those men who labor to delude any of us into an opinion that the object of contention between the parent state and the colonies is only 3d duty upon tea? I mean, he thinks this is absurd, and it's pretty obvious in how he's writing this. He said, the Parliament claims a right to tax us in all cases whatsoever. Its late acts are in virtue of that claim. How ridiculous, then, is it to affirm that we are quarreling for the trifling sum of 3d a pound on tea, when it is evidently the principle against which we contend. In February of 1775, Joseph Galloway, one of the leading loyalists in the colonies at the time, pushed for a plan of union of the colonies as a way to end the conflict. And Benjamin Franklin here, he was open to the plan, but only if certain conditions were met. And the first one was this: the Declaratory Act of Parliament to be repealed. Now, of course, we know that the British refused, and instead of repealing the Declaratory Act, we ended up with Lexington and Concord in April, and the shot heard round the world. And when war was already underway then, John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson made it official. In the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, July 6, 1775, passed unanimously by the Second Continental Congress. They ask, but why should we enumerate our injuries in detail? By one statute, It is declared that Parliament can, of right, make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. What is to defend us against so enormous, so unlimited a power? And that again was explaining why they were fighting back against the British. Why should they list all of the problems they have when all of the problems are just an outgrowth of the Declaratory Act, this unlimited centralized power in all cases whatsoever? And of course, Thomas Jefferson and company also included it as one of the so-called grievances, really injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. And in the harsh winter of 1776, in December, Thomas Paine, in The Crisis #1, or The American Crisis, after starting off with the famous line of, "These are the times that try men's souls," reminded the patriots of this: Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner, wrote Paine, is not slavery, then there is not such a thing as slavery upon earth. Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can belong only to God. The message was clear. Whether it was Hancock, Paine, Jefferson, Hamilton, Dickinson, the Continental Congress, first and second, they all saw the Declaratory Act of 1766 as the real root of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain. And decades later, James Madison also confirmed this view. He said the fundamental principle of the Revolution was that the colonies were coordinate members with each other and with Great Britain of an empire, united by a common executive sovereign, but not united by any common legislative sovereign. And he continued, a denial of these principles by Great Britain and the assertion of them by America produced the Revolution. He called this the fundamental principle on which our independence itself was declared. And the result, Madison put it better than anyone. He said, the assertion by Great Britain of a power to make laws for the other members of the empire in all cases whatsoever ended in the discovery that she had a right to make laws for them in no cases whatsoever. Here's the real deal. They lied to you about the American Revolution. From the moment Parliament claimed unlimited power in all cases whatsoever, with passage of the Declaratory Act of 1766, the fight wasn't about taxes or taxation without representation or just standing armies. It was about power. Revolutionaries like John Hancock and Thomas Paine, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee, John Dickinson, they all knew it. They all said it. It was the Declaratory Act and unlimited power in all cases whatsoever. And decades later, in his report of 1800, James Madison confirmed that view. This was the fundamental principle on which independence itself was declared. But you won't hear about this in government-run schools today, because teaching that truth means exposing the real problem: unlimited, centralized power. Man, that is one of the biggest reasons we work so hard every single day to reach and teach more and more people about these absolutely crucial principles from the American Revolution. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly devaluing dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month, and no one punches above their weight class better than the 10th Amendment Center. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options, or if you prefer to make a one-time contribution, or maybe you're already a member and you want to kick in a little bit more. No pressure at all, but I wanted to make sure you knew it was available. 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Again, it's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I couldn't be more grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member or putting your financial faith behind our work today. I really appreciate you being here. You can also help us spread the word in a bunch of free and easy peasy ways. Hitting the like button, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, subscribe, get notifications, a lot of watch time percentage. If you get closer to 100% or 120% watch time on a video, that really helps out a great deal. Comments in the archive and the like. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this show. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. And I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.